discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Scott Peterson entered the world in 1972 to an industrious and prosperous family. Both of his parents owned and ran their own businesses and provided a stable, affluent life for their son. Lee and Jackie Peterson had 6 children between them from previous relationships, but Scott was the only child that they'd had together, and he was the apple of their eye. And Scott seemed to be doing all he could do to live up to his family's lofty reputation right from the start. He grew up on the golf course with his father, and by the age of 14, Scott was actually better than Lee. This natural talent and passion paved the way for a bright future for Scott, and before long, he was one of the top teenage golfers in the whole of San Diego. That dedication was starting to pay off. He got into Arizona State University with a partial golf scholarship alongside other future pro golfers like Phil Mickelson. But for Scott, it turned out that pro golfing wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Chris Couch, another young golfer with a potentially bright future, was in Arizona for a recruiting trip when he and Scott did what young people at college typically do and went out for a drink. Somehow the cat got out of the bag, and Chris's father, Chip Couch, took things to a higher authority. He went to the golf coach at Arizona State University and complained, and pinned the whole wayward night on Scott Peterson. Scott then lost his place on the team, which then led to him losing his position in the golf program and his scholarship. But perhaps more fatefully for Scott's story in life, it turned him away from professional golfing. Scott dropped out of Arizona State and enrolled in California Polytechnic State University instead, where he studied agricultural business, and his path took a turn again. The daughter of local dairy farmers, Laci LaRocha, was no stranger to hard work. She grew up helping her parents and her brother run the farm, and she had a green thumb. She was studying ornamental agriculture at Cal Poly, the same university as Scott Peterson, when they met through a mutual friend. A short while after that, Laci gave Scott her number. A little while longer, and Laci was calling up her mother to tell her that she'd met the man she was going to marry. Scott seemed to agree, and he put all lingering thoughts of a professional career playing golf behind him so he could focus on getting a business degree and providing for his future family. Scott and Laci married in 1997, and by 1998 they'd already bought and were running their own business together, a local sports bar in San Luis Obispo called The Shack. The Shack did well and life moved on, and before anyone knew it, Scott and Laci had sold their restaurant and were moving to Laci's hometown of Modesto, California, to find their roots and grow their family. Laci pulled away from a career, choosing instead to work part-time and to focus on becoming a housewife in preparation for any children she and Scott would be having. It took a few years, but finally in 2002, the couple received the news that their first child together was on the way. Little Connor Peterson was due in February 2003, and it looked like he would come into a charmed and picture-perfect life filled with stability and love. But wheels had been set into motion that would, unfortunately, derail the whole thing. On December 23, 2002, Scott and the very pregnant Laci stopped by her sister's salon to get Scott's haircut. Christmas was around the corner. The young couple were full of excitement and the holiday spirit, and they had the perfect Christmas Eve planned out in front of them. Scott was going to go play golf, and Laci was staying home to rest up, clean up, and watch one of her favorite programs, Martha Stewart. But by the following morning, plans had already changed. As Laci sat down to watch her episode of Martha Stewart, Scott gathered up his things and told her that he was on his way to Berkeley Marina to go fishing. The couple said their goodbyes, and that was that. Later that day, a neighbor found the Petersons' dog, Mackenzie, out and on the street with a muddy leash still attached to his collar. The neighbor let the dog back into the Petersons' yard and didn't think any more about it. At around 2:15, Scott called Laci's phone and left a message saying that he was just leaving the marina and would be home soon. He arrived shortly after to find his dog still out in the backyard, Laci's car in the driveway, and his home empty. Scott then hopped in the shower, changed his clothes, and when he found out that his wife still wasn't home from whatever it was she must have been doing, he went out looking for her. He knocked on a neighbor's door and told him that he'd been out playing golf all day and hadn't seen Laci since he came home. He also said that she wasn't answering his calls, and he was starting to get worried. After that, Scott called Laci's family and asked if they'd seen her. At around 6 p.m., pretty much as soon as Laci's mother, Sharon, got the call from Scott, Sharon reported her daughter is missing. The police immediately took a report of a heavily pregnant missing woman very seriously, and they rushed to the Peterson home, where many of Laci's family and friends were already gathering, ready to help with the search. Many of those same family and friends recounted that Scott told them that he'd been out playing golf that day, despite the message that the investigators later recovered saying that he was leaving the marina at around 2 o'clock that afternoon, and despite what Scott would say to the investigators himself. To everyone else, Scott allegedly said that he'd gone to play golf that day, but to the police, he told them that he'd gone fishing in Berkeley Marina, just like he did in his message to Laci. Laci's family all jumped at the opportunity to defend Scott from any probing questions from the police and rushed to describe Scott and Laci's relationship as perfect. A little over a month after Laci first disappeared, and all of that changed. Seeing the news that Laci was missing on the TV, a woman called into the police and delivered some case-breaking news herself. The woman was Amber Fry, and she'd been in a relationship with Scott since November of 2002. Amber said Scott first told her that he was single, and on a following date had mentioned that his wife died, and this upcoming Christmas was the first Christmas he would be spending without her. Amber believed him and didn't realize that she was actually the mistress until she'd seen Laci on the TV. It turned out that Amber was the latest of 3 affairs that Scott had on Laci over the years. One of them even dated back to around 1998, when Scott and Laci had just opened the shack together in St. Louis Obispo and hadn't even been married a year yet. When they found all this out, the investigators found themselves asking what else Scott had been hiding from them and everyone else around him. But it's what he'd said to Amber that put the authorities on high alert. He told Amber that Laci was already dead, and he told her that about a month before Laci had even gone missing. Had Scott just been telling a lie to gain sympathy from a woman he wanted to have an affair with, or had he already been planning to get rid of Laci? When investigators broke the news that Scott had been having affairs with Laci's family, all of them changed their tunes and said that he must have killed her. But murder is a difficult thing to prove when there isn't a body to back the claim up. In April of 2003, around 2 months after his due date, a couple found the body of a baby on the shore of San Francisco Bay. The very next day, about a mile away, the remains of a woman washed up from the water, her head, arms, and most of her legs missing. It was only through DNA testing that the pair of them were identified as Laci and Connor. No cause of death could be determined for either of them, but Laci was in a far worse condition than her son was in. It looked like Connor had survived longer than Laci and had been protected by her body for an indeterminate amount of time. Investigators couldn't even say if he'd been alive when he hit the water, as his body shows signs of changes that only tend to happen after a baby is actually born. The discovery of the bodies led to the almost immediate arrest of Scott, who had changed his hair color, had both his and his brother's driver's license on him, and around $15,000 in cash in his car. He also had camping supplies and food, but claimed he had been living in the car because of all the media attention and had not been planning on running away. What started after that was a grisly trial. The prosecution argued that his long history of affairs, Laci's tempting life insurance policy, the fear of becoming a father, and finding the new love of his life, Amber Fry, had pushed Scott into murdering his wife and his unborn child. The defense argued that someone who'd built up as good of a life for himself as Scott had wouldn't be throwing it away for a masseuse and a mistress like Amber Fry. The prosecution and the defense went back and forth, with the prosecution relying heavily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimonies, like the witness who claimed to have heard Scott saying that he was out playing golf, not fishing, that day. Jury members came and went, but finally they came back with the verdict. Scott Peterson was guilty of the murder of his wife and child, and he was sentenced to death. The $250,000 life insurance policy went to Laci's mother, and Scott was sent to death row, where he continued to claim his innocence and fight the case. In 2021, the court commuted his death sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2023, his lawyers filed a suit claiming that new evidence has emerged that would prove Scott's innocence. In January of 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project, a nonprofit organization that provides defense teams for the allegedly wrongfully convicted, announced that they would be taking over Scott's defense. And that's where the case of Scott Peterson rests today. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen. And by the way, speaking of this Scott Peterson episode, I've mentioned before that this is a story that I've kind of avoided a little bit because of the uncertainty of his guilt. Personally, I have my own beliefs. It's slanted toward guilty, but obviously I have no way of knowing that for sure, but it certainly looks like with his actions that he is guilty. I don't know. But with the thing that bothers me the most about this case, other than the actual crime of it all, aside from that, is the treatment at the time of Amber Frey. I was alive and consuming true crime stories at that time in my life, and pretty young person, but still able to recognize that they were doing her dirty, like the media. She was the other woman, the mistress. She always had unflattering photos of herself posted all over tabloids and news all the time, and she was just the lady that was in a relationship with a single guy, she thought, and then did nothing but help the case that got him convicted. She turned him in. What she did behind the scenes helped to convict Scott of murder, and she did nothing but positive for the case, and she still gets just absolutely trashed on the media, and I don't understand it. I mean, I get that she was, hooking up with a married guy, but she didn't know that. It was pretty clear that she didn't know that. So that's the part of the story that gets to me the most, outside of the actual crime of it all. Hey, if you're new to 10-Minute Murder, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen today, like I said, and make sure you hit subscribe wherever you are listening. If you happen to be checking it out on YouTube, that's cool. Just know that there are many, many more episodes available on all of the podcast listening apps. And coming up on the next episode of 10-Minute Murder, we're going to be talking about a young black boy that was executed in 1944 for the murders of two white girls in a small southern town. 80 years later, his guilt is still a topic of debate. Not only is this case still debated, but it's as fresh in the minds of the family members as it was then. The emotions are raw and the outcome is devastating. And we're going to be talking about George Stinney Jr. That's coming up on the next episode of the podcast. And that's going to do it. Thank you for listening to another 10-Minute Murder podcast episode. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.